everyone, and welcome to Survive the Script, where we analyze horror movies and play RPGs to answer that all-important question, can you survive this horror movie? This series will be talking about The Crow. I'm your final guy, Nick, and with me as always is my co-host and final gal.
I'm your final gal, Kylie. Thanks for tuning in. All right, so Nicholas, let's dive right in. Tell me, what's a summary of The Crow?
All right. Well, I got it pulled up right here on IMDb. So we got a few posted up, but I'll just go with one that seems about the right level of detail here. A poetic guitarist, Eric Draven, is brought back to life by a crow a year after he and his fiancée are murdered. The crow guides him through the land of living and leads him to his killers, Tintin, Funboy, T-Bird, and unsophisticated Skank. One by one, Eric gives these thugs a taste of their own medicine. However, their leader, Top Dollar, a world-class crime lord who will dispatch his enemies with a Japanese sword and a joke about it later, will soon learn the legend of the crow and the secret to the vigilante's invincibility.
Woo! Good summary. All right, so here is an introduction to the film. The budget for this film was $23 million. Originally, it was slightly less, but for reasons that we will explain, due to certain CGI practices that had to be added in, the budget got bumped up quite a bit. But the film did gross $94 million worldwide. This film was released May 11th, 1994. And can you guess what the tomato meter versus the audience meter is on Rotten Tomatoes for this film?
For Rotten Tomatoes, I'm going to guess, Kylie, that the score is 63%.
The tomato meter score was 84%.
What?
And go ahead, guess the audience score, since you're on such a roll right now.
I'm going to say 75%.
Audience was 90%.
People liked this movie?
Yes, they did. And before we get into Letterboxd and how it holds up with modern audiences, this movie, we obviously have to pay respects to the original Eric Draven, Brandon Lee, who lost his life due to the heart and soul that he put into this film. I have a little bit more of details about that for the deep dive, and as soon as we get through the Letterboxd, but I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention it in the beginning of the intro. So, for Letterboxd, what do you think the score was out of 5?
Out of 5, I'm going to say 4.5.
Okay, you were a lot closer. It was a 3.7.
Oh my goodness, no consistency whatsoever. Okay.
So, a couple of the reviews were, Patrick said, I miss the time when entire movies looked like early 90s rock music videos. And then Molly said, it's Joker for people who had a grunge phase in middle school. This film was directed by Alex Proya. This was his first theatrical motion picture and his most successful. This was initially developed by Paramount Pictures, and they initially financed the film. However, after Brandon Lee tragically died, they shut down production. Entertainment Media Investment Corporation was created for the purpose to buy the film and finish making it using CGI, special effects, and body doubles. But Paramount did get the film back in 2020 after Paramount bought a minority stake in Miramax, who had owned the film. So, a couple of details on Brandon Lee and his tragic shooting, and obviously this is a trigger warning for gun use and death. So Brandon Lee was tragically shot and later died in the hospital due to a prop gun error. For reference, prop guns are typically filled with twice as much gunpowder, even though there's blanks, but they're filled with twice as much gunpowder to be realistic. So if anything goes wrong, if there's anything left on the gun handle or anything like that, and a piece of that fires, it's going to create more of an impact than a normal gun would. So he was shot during Eric and Shelley's death scene. Originally, the gun was wrapped in a grocery bag, but as we can see in the film, that is not the case. They did not use that take. So the scene was completed without him, and Lee's face was CGI'd on. The original footage was said to be destroyed or in police custody and investigations, but the death was ruled accidental. So the gun was fired by actor Michael Massey, who experienced a whole lot of trauma for this, because obviously that was not his intention at all. This was what we would call a lack of some safety structures on set, which still happens today, unfortunately. So the tip of the... So there was a bullet tip that wound up in the barrel of the handgun. I'm just making sure my facts are right. That was shot, and usually you're supposed to check, make sure there's nothing in the barrel before you shoot. And it struck Brandon Lee in the abdomen, creating an entry wound about the size of a silver dollar. Years later, actually that year, Brandon Lee's mom, Linda Lee Caldwell, sued 14 entities for negligence for safety during the film, which resulted in a $3 million settlement. So upon the tip being fired into Brandon Lee, nobody yelled cut because they thought he was acting. They thought that the blood was a blood packet, which he had on him, but he didn't have any sort of armor or a bulletproof vest on, and he was within 20 feet of the shot. However, in the end, they ended up making this film because Brandon's fiance gave the blessing to the director, and they ended up finishing the film.
Oh my goodness. That's quite the story. And it kind of reminds me, because you were saying like stuff still goes on like that. It makes me think of the Alec Baldwin story that's going on right now. That's still kind of in the news.
Yeah, it's definitely still in the news. Safety on set is still definitely a concern. There's ways that it can constantly improve. And this goes to show that that is one of those situations where it can still be improved then in the 90s and today, where last year somebody, a cinematographer, was horrifically shot and died. Brandon Lee died 6 hours into surgery, leaving his fiance behind, which is why in the credits it says, "For Brandon and Eliza."
That's what it was. Okay. I didn't put two and two together.
You're all right. For the people who have not listened before, Nick and I are both not very good at trivia. So we like to play monster movie trivia to see if we can survive. We have 3 chances to get it wrong, and if you get it wrong 3 times, you are dead. You've been slashed 3 times, you're dead, you're out. But the point is to get a compilation of questions to help you understand the film and the history of the film a little bit better. So, shall we begin?
Yes, and I will add that, as in traditional fashion, I have come unprepared. So this will be great.
Yeah, if you've been listening long enough, that is kind of his brand, and I always have like 8 pages of notes. But I still do bad at trivia, so nobody wins. All right.
Exactly.
Question number 1. What year did this film come out?
1994.
Yeah, good job. Okay. All right. Question number 2. Who are Brandon Lee's parents?
Brandon Lee Sr. and did you say her name? You're just giving her name in the little story. Did you say her name was Miriam?
No.
Was it Eliza?
You've earned... No. That's his fiance. Nicholas, you've earned
a there we go, first slash. Okay.
Brandon Lee's
Get
parents
the first one out of the way.
The very famous Bruce Lee and Linda Lee Caldwell.
Bruce Lee?
Bruce Lee is his dad.
Oh my goodness, I did not know. I have a lot of respect for that man. Okay.
All right. In what unique color scale did they originally want to shoot the film?
What?
So, like, color scale, whether they want to have Like shoot it in grayscale, black or white, high saturation, stuff like that.
Uh, grayscale.
Close. That's a slash. So.
What? Oh my goodness. The movie was so dark anyways. I mean, grayscale sounds like it would have made sense.
So they originally wanted to shoot the film in black and white, but use high contrast, high saturated colors for the flashbacks, which is pretty similar to what they did. However, the studios were like, absolutely not, we're not doing black and white, but they wanted to do black and white to honor the comic book creator.
Okay.
Which leads me to my next question. What is the name of the comic creator?
Say it one more time, sorry.
What is the name of the original comic creator?
Perfect. James O'Barr.
Congratulations, you got one right.
Okay, you said that, but you shook your head no, and I didn't quite hear it first.
Yes, you got it right. How many Crow comic novels were there?
5.
No.
What?
Check Wikipedia, my dude. Wikipedia says 7.
There is indeed 7. When I did my research, I focused on books 1 through 5 and ignored that there's a prologue and an epilogue. So, yes, you're right. There is 7.
Woo! All right, take another slash, my friend, as I've defeated you quicker than I ever have before.
Oh!
So, for those who were getting the questions right, I will read off the rest of the questions and answers because I feel like some of them were really interesting. So, I literally was keeping track of how many you were getting right, and that was the quickest game of monster movie trivia we've ever done. All right. So, how many real birds were used in the filming of The Crow?
100.
The answer is 5. This is a very humbling night for Nick. Everyone be nice to him in the comments, otherwise I will come for you. How many characters were not referred to by name?
I'm gonna say I can only think of one, maybe. And that was the pawn shop owner.
3.
3.
And the characters that were not referred to by name are Top Dollar, Micah, and Grange. They are never referred to by name. So there were 2 famous actors who turned down the role for Eric Draven. Who were they?
Brad Pitt and I don't know. I can't think of it. I'm drawing a blank right now.
You're good. So the 2 actors who turned down the role of Eric Draven were River Phoenix and Christian Slater.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. They were clearly, like, that makes sense for the type of the role, but I was really a little surprised by that.
Although, trying to picture Christian Slater as not a voice actor is weird for me, so.
Who was the character who was supposed to be Eric's guide, who was cut entirely after Brandon died?
Eric's guide?
Yeah, so there was a guide that was supposed to come in. I have a little bit more on his character later, but he was cut entirely as a character.
I'm just going to bring out a random answer because I really have no clue. It was Charles Rowe.
No,
Rowe.
It's a very good try. The character's name was Skull Cowboy, played by Michael Berryman. It was supposed to be a character who was, like, taunting him along as he was supposed to achieve his vengeance. Michael Berryman was born with hypohidrotic ectodermal dysplasia, which is a rare condition categorized by the absence of sweat glands, hair, and fingernails. So the Skull Cowboy was essentially supposed to look like somebody who didn't complete his quest and is stuck on the Earth plane for eternity as, like, a dead character.
I was going to say it's rare because it sounds like it's made up.
No, I looked it up. It's very real. So, would you like to intro us into our next segment, my friend?
All right. So, here is a slightly new one that Kylie and I have decided that we would like to talk about,
Mm-hmm.
where we're just calling it, was this scary? Where Kylie and I will debate whether or not this movie was indeed scary. Can we call it a true horror film?
Hmm.
So maybe we agree, and this will be very short. Maybe we disagree, and this will be a fun little debate. Let's see what happens. So
All
Kylie,
right.
why don't you start us off? Was this movie scary? Would you call it a horror film?
So I wouldn't call it a traditional horror film. However, it does have all the aspects that make a horror film outside of the fact that it originally comes from a comic book series, which I guess now there are horror comics. There are horror comics out there in general. So I really am on the fence because there are supernatural elements and he's rising from the dead. It is quite gory in parts, much gorier than Silence of the Lambs that we watched last time. So I would say from both the supernatural, like prior evil element and the aspect of supernatural, yeah, like I said, so supernatural and the gore in general, I would say create a horror package. The only difference I would say is there is the need to fight for vengeance the whole time. It's like the crow is the predator in this rather than the monster is the predator. So that would be my only thing from outwardly saying this could qualify as horror, but I would call it like it's a hero origin story. So
Okay. I do not believe this was a horror film. I don't think it was scary. It was a big one. There's no intent I see from the film to scare you, more or less, really, just kind of, if anything, maybe jar the viewer. You know, make them look in disgust at something, but definitely no real way to horrify people except for, two characters that were making out.
I feel like that alone makes it horror.
um, so no, I think this was more of a anti-hero comic film.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about a man who tries to seek vengeance and is willing to not play by the rules in order to get that. And he has supernatural powers. So to me, that's great. And the fact that it's based off a comic book. It's a comic book film.
There are
Anti-hero.
also horror comic books, though, like horror movie comic books.
Yeah, you could argue like Spawn, sure. But even Spawn does more of like a tries to scare you type of deal with its depictions of hell and things like that. But in this case, I don't know. I'm leaning, or I'm not leaning on it. I'm gonna take my stance. This is not a horror film.
All right. Well, then, on that note, will you tell me what your thoughts and opinions are on this film? Because I think we both can kind of agree it's not traditionally horror, but I think it falls a lot of its gore and the supernatural element make it qualifiable enough for us to review on our podcast.
That's fair enough. And just as a note for the listeners, the whole point of this segment was to hopefully make some more concrete rules. Kylie and I dive deeper into other movies about what does make a movie a horror film.
Yeah. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, as far as deep dive goes, first opinion, I'm gonna say that I did not like this movie.
Really? Okay.
No.
Tell me what you didn't like. It seems
Well,
like you don't like most of them, so I need to start letting you pick them.
no, that's fine. It's always interesting to hear someone's opinion for not liking a movie. In this case, it was mostly mostly I just didn't like how gross and I guess R-rated everything kind of was.
Mm.
Um, I guess to
Isn't that
put it
how a
in a
lot of
different
horror
way.
movies are?
You have a point there. You have a point. But this one was more about the sexual content and also um, the focus on vengeance as even though it's supposed to be a superhero of sorts. On top of that, I couldn't get over how much it seems to me like the storyline. This is a storyline written by a moody teenager going through his emo phase.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
That being so, I mean, come on. They would have scenes where Brandon Lee, as Eric, just uh, they cut away from the main storyline for him to just go and play some sad song on his electric guitar, and then literally just go break it on the rooftop.
That is
I'm
like,
just like,
that's
oh,
very 90s though.
it is. That's the other part of it. That's not great. So it's a comic book movie, like I said. And it's a
Mhm.
comic book movie made by the 90s. Anyone who's a big comic book fan um, traditionally knows that most 90s superhero films were not great. It was kind of a sad era. It was sort of it's the era where we kind of say like, these movies walk so that the current ones that are good could run.
Mhm.
So um, that's the main reason why I didn't like it. But all that said, I did like the character of the Crow and what it is. Uh, just the idea that someone can come back from the dead, has all these cool supernatural powers, and uh, it seems like the character himself had a level of purity about him that I enjoyed. He was an
Mhm.
innocent character, besides the fact that he's seeking vengeance and murdering people. Um, but I guess so. As I talk about it more, it also just reminds me that one of the things people say is makes a great superhero film um, is the villain,
Mhm.
and the villain was just not good. Top Dollar wasn't good as a villain.
I loved his voice. It was so deep and gravelly.
Yes, the voice is fine, but just like as supposed, the idea that he's supposed to be someone who can be a threat to the Crow
Mhm.
is not very believable. And also the fact that if he just left the Crow alone to kill T-Bird and the rest of them, he would have been fine. Makes it kind of like he just had to not get in the Crow's way, and he could have still won.
Yeah.
That kind of tells me that this was not the best written story. But then again, people can always die because of their hubris, and is probably his case. But like I said, all that to say though, there is a hidden gem in here that I do think exists.
Okay.
So I'm excited for future films to see what they do, and see if they can maybe improve upon what this film was.
Yeah. All right. Well, I like the concept of the Crow as a character. I really like how emotionally vulnerable he is. And yes, if that means he's sitting on the roof playing his electric guitar riffs on the roof, I'm fine with that. I will say I agree with you in the sense that the story wasn't the strongest in my opinion. I think I would have liked to have seen more of the purpose behind the mask. I know we got that brief shot, but more of his relationship with Shelley. But the visuals for this film were striking. Going from the dark haziness to these bright flashes of color, especially when it would flash white. There were a couple times where I was like, my brain is having a hard time processing this right now. But I've never quite watched a film quite like it. I think would be my honest opinion, because I was watching it and I was like, this is really a very aggressive grunge dystopia that they're living in, where chaos reigns and this one dude is like the only bad guy. But I really liked the overall filming style with the color palettes that they use, and then filming from the crow's eye view versus like the regular camera to give different perspectives of what was going on. So I really liked that. The other thing too that was like I had a hard time understanding and relating to the motivation of the villain, which I don't know if that is a writing thing, but I was like, okay, he wants chaos to control, and what? There's not going to be anything left for him based on how this has been going. So,
Mhm.
I liked Michael Wincott as a villain because of his voice, and I literally have a note
Oh
of
yeah,
Micah and Top Dollar are siblings, half siblings, WTF, with like a bunch of F's afterwards. So,
yeah. See, that's the one thing. It's like the fact that there's incest of some sort in here. I'm like, no, I can't. I just can't get on board with this film for things like that.
mhm.
Um, but I did take some notes. You're mentioning the mask, which reminds me of how silly. There's a lot of comic book tropes. Again, I'm viewing this as a comic book movie, and one of the comic book tropes are those silly origin stories where it's like, oh, I see a mask hit or just like on my mirror.
Mhm.
Let me just make my makeup look exactly like that mask.
Yeah,
Oh,
that makes more sense that it's a comic book thing, because I saw that and I was like, I know this is a shared memory between them, but I'm having a hard time getting on board. But I did love, there were so many moments of compassion and just like real raw emotions, whether that was the cop in the beginning telling Sarah that Eric and Shelly aren't going to make it, and trying to tell her gently, but also not trying to tell her. Like, there were some really cool, emotionally deep moments, especially for a comic book. Like, you don't see that very often in our Avengers stuff unless it's very drastic. Like, spoiler alert, Scarlett Johansson throwing herself off the cliff and dying. Then that's when you get like a very large reaction. But out of something small that is just seemingly small and part of an origin story, that was some really beautiful emotional reactions that they got out of me as an audience member. All right, so since this is based on a comic book and we have a comic book nerd here, would you like to talk about the origins of the comics?
I would.
I've prepared for my role.
Okay, so doing my research, looking through the fan wiki to get a better understanding. The comic series of The Crow, written by James O'Barr, started off in 1989, where was it the writer James created the Crow in order to help him get over the loss of his fiancee who died in a car accident.
Wow.
So this was his coping mechanism.
Wow.
Um,
This is how he grieved. That's beautiful.
exactly. Which is why I would also say um, I probably think the comics themselves would be better than the movie.
Mm. Okay.
But I haven't read the comics, so I don't know. But anyways, um, so first it was published by Caliber Comics in 1989,
Mm-hmm.
then by Tundra Publishing in 1992, then Kitchen Sink Press in 1993, and as of right now, Pocketbooks currently holds the rights to the title of The Crow. So there were, as you discussed, Kylie, there were 7 total publications.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the prologue, the books 1 through 5, and then the epilogue.
Okay.
So I was making some notes based off the summaries for each of the books, minus the 2 that I apparently forgot, that I overlooked, on what the differences were in the story. And I found that there were a few different changes that, I mean, I don't know if you consider these significant or not, so I'll leave those up to the listeners here. But to kind of go through them really quick. Um, so, first thing I saw was that Top Dollar was actually killed very quickly in the first book, right after Tintin was, the guy with the knife.
Wow. Okay.
So Top Dollar was not actually the main villain for the Crow.
Interesting.
Uh, turns out that was actually T-Bird,
Oh.
the guy who was killed in the car accident.
Yeah, in the car
Not a car
accident.
accident. Um, so what actually happened in the comics was rather than being killed in their apartment, um, Eric or yeah, it was Eric and Shelly were off on the side of the road having car troubles, and they happened to cross paths then with T-Bird and his crew, and
Mhm.
then from there it's kind of a similar story where they uh, T-Bird and his crew kill both Shelly and Eric. Eric doesn't immediately die, but he does die on the way to the hospital.
Okay.
So, and then 1 year later, he comes back and seeks revenge. Um, let's see. Then there is so there was no actual character Sarah
Mhm.
in the comics. Instead, she is called the closest equivalent is this character called Sherry.
Okay.
But she has no actual history with Eric. So
Oh,
that was
interesting.
something that's different. Um, also, I didn't see this in the movie, but Eric has a history of self-harm, which we kind of see revealed in book 3.
Oh,
So I thought
wow.
that was an interesting beat to have
Yeah,
that type
that's
of
a really
characterization.
interesting, like, deep emotional detail to that.
hmm And so that, I mean, like to have a character who has to deal with that type of depression and whatnot, that seems more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. So what else I got here? T-Bird is the big bad. Um, and then throughout the remaining 4 publications or 4 different books,
Mhm.
basically we just get the continuing story of the Crow going off and killing one of T-Bird's crew until he eventually gets to T-Bird himself.
Oh, wow.
So that all finished, like I said, back in 1993. And then from there, we get our movie. And
Mhm.
then starting about 2008, we've just kind of had this rumor after rumor of remakes of The Crow going on. So starting in 2008, there was a Stephen Norrington wanted to remake the movie. But since then, the film rights have been moving from one director to the next, or rather the position to direct it. And the role of the Crow has been been rumored to be played by different actors. So at one point, Bradley Cooper was rumored to be playing the Crow. Channing Tatum was on there. Mark Wahlberg, Ryan Gosling, Luke Evans.
Wow.
Um,
Well, they have
so,
three that did come out. They had one in 1996, one in 2000, and one in 2005.
so then that's a case of these movies just don't tend to get a lot of publicity.
No, they
Um,
don't. That seems
so
to be true.
we'll see if with the eventual remake that's also going to be coming out again soon, and with the fan film that we'll be talking about in the later episode, we'll
Yeah.
see if some really good juicy details and good plot come out of those.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna add a little bit more about James O'Barr, the creator of the comics. I your deep dive was awesome. I didn't know there was so much about the comics that I didn't know. He actually made a cameo in this film. He played a looter in the riot scene. And his vision, as well as the director's vision, as well as Brandon Lee's vision, was for the entire film to be in black and white, except for the Technicolor flashbacks. All the studios were like, that's a hard pass. In fact, the studios did have some different visions for this. One studio executive suggested that he makes it a musical and it stars Michael Jackson, which Obar laughed in his face and was like, absolutely
Yeah,
not.
understandably.
So, I mean, understandably, like, he profited off of this somewhat, and he actually donated a lot of the profits. He bought his mom a car, bought himself a sound system, and donated the rest. He felt a lot of guilt from profiting from this movie after Brandon passed away, so he was like, I don't want this money. I'm donating it.
Very
I
nice.
have more information on Brandon Lee, the director, some production design, animal handling, casting, and more. What would you like to hear about?
Um, let's go with animal handling. Since
Okay.
I horribly failed at that question about the crows. None of
Yeah.
the crows.
So, fun fact: none of the birds in this movie are crows. Let me just blow your
That's
mind for a second. Larry
like the most
Madrid.
common bird you could find.
So Larry Madrid was the animal trainer for this project, and he decided that ravens would be a better fit for the role because they're smarter birds and easier to train. So only 5 real ravens were actually used in production, and it was mostly for the close-ups. Wide shots and the flocks were all special effects.
I wonder if that was the reason for. I mean, another thing I didn't like. Sorry, I keep coming back to this, but Draven, Raven in the name. That to me was funny. And then the fact that we get that scene with Brandon Lee in the pawn shop
Mhm.
quoting Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. I was like, oh, brother. I rolled my eyes.
The whole film gives very Poe vibes. I liked that part. I liked the grunginess. That's where we differ.
Yeah.
So, a little bit about the actors in this film. So, Brandon Lee is the son of Bruce Lee and Linda Lee Caldwell, which you should have gotten right earlier. He was in a few smaller films, in a few episodes of TV, but The Crow was supposed to be his breakout film. And he had a lot of creative input on the script. So he said himself in an interview that he was responsible for asking that a particular Asian character that was like an Asian stereotype be removed entirely. A particular villain. He was like, no, we don't need this in our script. But in an interview, what he enjoyed the most about playing the role was the supernatural aspect and understanding the world from a unique point of view after coming back from the dead. He thought that was a really fun, challenging aspect of the character to play. And I'll include in the show notes a couple links to interviews that he did before he passed, but he seemed like just a very humble guy who really loved the work that he was doing. A couple of the other actors in the film, the actress who played Sarah, Rochelle Davis, this was her film debut. This was her very first film. And she ended up having a huge role in it when originally it was the Skull Cowboy who was kind of supposed to be the guide and the narrator when she ended up narrating through the end. T-Bird, he really just loved the depth of emotions that this film could carry. And he was a method actor. So that's just a fun fact. You could imagine him on set. The Ernie Hudson, who played Albright, he described this movie as it's now and happening. It's a very present film and that it's relatable for everybody emotionally. Michael
Okay,
Massey.
I can see that.
Yeah, I feel like that is true. Michael Massey, who's the actor who played Fanboy, he's the one who pulled the trigger. So, Massey had said that he had nightmares about the incident for years and even took a break from acting. He's never been able to sit and watch the Crow film. So he passed away in 2016, and his legacy is only that he was involved in Lee's demise, even though he had a very successful career after that. Let's talk about production design. So Alex Proyas was the director. He wanted to shoot it in black and white, and the studio said no. So Proyas shot the movie in a monochromatic color scheme, so a lot of reds and dark grays, which is, I think, what makes the film stand out. The production designer team took this and ran with it, along with the sketches of the comic book. So Alex McDowell, apologies, the production designer, his goal was to keep the integrity of the comics while pushing it a little bit further. So he very strongly controlled the color palette, so that's why we see it as close to black and white as possible. The Darren Guilford was the illustrator who initially sketched what would become all these buildings and stuff. He later worked on Tron and The Force Awakens and much more. So we have another Star Wars connection within the films that we're talking about. But they really wanted to capture the images in the comic books of this dark, romantic, violent rock and roll world. They did a lot of miniatures on this film, which I thought was fascinating, because they had a really small budget initially. They only had 15 million initially, which is not a lot for a stylistic film. So the opening shots of Detroit on fire, those were all miniatures. A lot of the car chase was miniatures, because they couldn't afford to do it for real on the big streets.
Wow, those were some really good looking miniatures then. I didn't even think about that watching.
There you go. Now you have something that you like about it. I will say the production design
there were a couple things I did like about it.
I will say the production design was really impressive, considering that so much of this film was done as miniatures. Even the cathedral originally was miniatures, and there were a couple shots done with that. And then they did build out something bigger so they could go inside and all that. Another interesting point here. So the writing took 2 years to write. The original writer was John Shirley, who'd only been writing in print at that point, but was later joined by John Schroe, who did Critters and Leatherface. After Brandon Lee passed away, they worked with Proyas, the director, to rework the script, to soften it, and to make it honor Brandon Lee. So that's when they decided Sarah would narrate instead of Skull Cowboy. And I liked the quote from the film, "Sometimes something so bad happens that the crow can bring that soul back and put wrong things right." And so that's how they wanted to honor him, to make it a story of like emotional truth rather than just vengeance, such a harsh emotion. I will say, people have said, not that I agree with this, but this was part of my research, that this set is cursed. There were a variety of incidents that took place on the set of The Crow. A carpenter drove a screwdriver through his hand. A stuntman fell through a roof. Disgruntled crew members drove their cars into an on-set workshop. There were a lot of injuries that have happened throughout the Crow films. Supposedly, even Brandon Lee cut his hand on prop glass, which is really rare. Prop glass is like, you could crunch it in your hands easily. And he was told by a crew member that that was a bad sign. So the sequels as well have had a lot of freak accidents, which has created this cult rumor that the film is cursed. And if you're listening on the podcast, I'm using quotations because I don't believe in that, but I felt like it was interesting to bring up. So do you want to see how they finished the film? Do you want to hear about that?
I would love to hear about it. How they finished it.
So after they got the blessing from Eliza, they had the special effects house DreamQuest work with them to finish the film. There were 52 shots that were digitally composed after he passed away, which is a lot of shots. That's quite a few. The primary techniques were using unused footage that was digitally composed. For example, the shot of Eric returning to his apartment after getting out of the grave. So that was different footage, maybe from a different take, that they just implanted onto the apartment. Additionally, they had Chad, I cannot pronounce his last name, Stalhinsky, who was a friend of Brandon Lee and a stunt performer who stood in for a lot of the new scenes, including the scene where Eric is wearing the makeup for the first time, approaching the window. And DreamQuest digitally grafted Lee's face from previous footage onto his body.
So, I mean, I kind of got a sense for that. I mean, I didn't know that at the beginning watching through. I
Hmm.
felt like I saw a couple things where I kind of looked at his face, like that seems kind of odd. And what really threw me off is because I was watching this on Amazon, and they always like show like, hey, this is who's on the currently on the scene. And every
Yeah.
time there was, oh, it would show, um, every time the character Rick Javen was on the screen, it would show like the two, Brandon Lee and the other guy. Sorry,
And
forgot
Chad.
his name. And Chad, uh, Brandon Lee and Chad, both on there. It's like how weird. So I think what helped them, and this is just my theory, obviously, but I think what helped them is the makeup,
Mhm.
having the makeup on for the character
Yeah.
helped a movie that was set in the 90s to be able to put someone else's face onto a character, make it at least a little bit more believable. But
Yeah.
even then, I kind of noticed, I was like, that something seems off about him right now in this scene.
But I will say, for the time, for the 90s, CGI was not used all that often. This is a pretty incredible feat that they overcame. Like, I watched it and I personally didn't notice, and that may be because I was focused on all these other things. But I thought it was really fascinating that they were able to believably redo 52 shots with a different person's body or his unused footage and still make it believable within the realm of the story. And I really liked this quote that Chad said. To this day, I believe that Brandon would have wanted the thing done and done well. And today it's still a cult classic. It's still one of my favorite films. I'm proud of the work. That situation obviously isn't unchangeable, so at least it came out the way it did. It was a good testament to who he was. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in and learning more about the creation of The Crow with us. We will include some of our sources in the show notes, and thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to follow along, whether you subscribe on YouTube or subscribe on your podcast app. That way you can stay in touch with all of our latest episodes. All right, bye.
Bye, everybody.